Hello, and welcome to Sleepy Ocean. I'm really glad you're here tonight. If you're the kind of person who likes to think their way into sleep, turning something slow and vast over in your mind until everything else goes quiet, then tonight is made for you. We're going to spend the next little while drifting down to the deepest, flattest places on our planet, the abyssal plains. Not the trenches, not the shallows. The wide, still floors of the ocean, where almost nothing moves, and the water above you is measured not in meters, but in kilometers. Take a slow breath now. Let your shoulders drop. If you want, close your eyes. Tonight, we'll touch on a few things that might surprise you. The fact that these plains are actually the smoothest terrain on Earth, that sediment there falls so slowly, it takes 1,000 years to pile up a single centimeter, and that the temperature down there holds almost perfectly still across decades. There's no rush. Now, let's begin. The abyssal plains are the flattest terrain on the surface of this planet. Not the Sahara, not the Kazakh steppe, not the salt flats of Bolivia. The abyssal plains. They cover roughly half of Earth's total surface area, most of it invisible beneath 3 to 6 kilometers of water. A mountain range that took millions of years of tectonic collision to build might rise and fall over hundreds of kilometers on land. On an abyssal plain, the relief across that same distance can be measured in a handful of meters. Sediment has been falling from the water above for so long. Particle by particle, shell fragment by shell fragment, that it has filled in and smoothed over nearly every scar the ocean floor ever had. The result is a stillness of shape that has no equivalent anywhere on dry land. Sediment sinks through the deep ocean at a pace that is almost impossible to feel. A single flake of marine snow, the loose organic material drifting down from the sunlit water above, can take 2 weeks to travel 1 kilometer. By the time it arrives on the plain, it carries almost no energy at all. The accumulation rate at the deepest abyssal floors averages somewhere between 1 and 5 millimeters every 1,000 years. Roughly the thickness of a credit card across an entire millennium. If you wanted to build up a layer the depth of a standard paperback novel lying flat, you would need to wait somewhere between 40 and 200,000 years. And yet, in places, the sediment blanket is over 500 meters thick. Evidence not of speed, but of patience measured in geological time. The water sitting directly above an abyssal plain is among the coldest water in the ocean. Deep water forms near the poles, where the surface chills until it grows dense enough to sink. It travels slowly along the ocean floor, sometimes for hundreds or even thousands of years, before it reaches an abyssal basin. By the time it arrives, it has lost nearly all the warmth it ever carried. Temperatures at abyssal depths typically hold between 1 and 4 degrees Celsius, and they hold there with remarkable consistency. A thermometer placed on the abyssal floor of the South Atlantic would record almost the same number this decade as it would have in the middle of the last century. Cold, still, and deep. Held in place by the sheer weight of ocean pressing down from above. Pressure on the abyssal plain is something the human body was not built to imagine. 4 kilometers down, a fairly typical abyssal depth. The pressure reaches roughly 400 atmospheres, or about 400 times the weight of the air column pressing down on you right now. That's approximately the weight of 40 adult elephants resting on a single dinner plate. Materials that would simply float in shallow water are compressed at abyssal depths. Glass spheres used in deep ocean instruments must be precision made. because imperfect glass would be crushed to fragments long before it reached the floor. And yet many organisms live at these pressures without any particular difficulty. They have simply never known anything else. A large portion of the abyssal floor is covered in small, round stones. They are called polymetallic nodules, and they form over millions of years around a tiny seed, a shark tooth, a fragment of bone, a grain of sediment. Minerals dissolved in the seawater precipitate around that seed, ring by ring, at a rate of about 10 millimeters every million years. The result is a dense, dark ball, roughly the size of a plum, scattered across the plain in concentrations that can reach dozens per square meter across. Thousands of kilometers of seafloor. Each one is older than the mountain ranges most of us have ever seen. They sit there quietly in the dark, growing at a pace so slow that the word gradual does not begin to cover it. The abyssal plains were largely unknown to science until the middle of the 20th century. Before then, the deep ocean floor was assumed to be rugged, an underwater mirror of the mountain ranges on land. The first systematic echo-sounding surveys of the deep Atlantic, conducted in the 1940s and 50s, returned profiles that confused researchers. Not jagged peaks, but sweeping, almost featureless flats extending for hundreds of kilometers. The name Abyssal Plain was coined and applied to something that turned out to cover more of Earth's surface than all the continents combined. The tools that revealed them were crude by modern standards. A pulse of sound sent down, a timer, and the echo returning. And yet, that simple method sketched the outline of something vast enough to reframe the entire picture of what our planet looks like. The deep ocean acts as a kind of thermal memory, holding the temperature of ancient surface water. Water that sank to the abyssal floor near the poles carries a record of the surface conditions at the time it sank. Its temperature, its chemistry, even traces of the gases that were dissolved in the atmosphere above it. Scientists can read these records in the water itself and in the shells of tiny organisms preserved in the sediment below. Some of the deep water currently sitting on abyssal plains in the Pacific began its descent at the surface several centuries ago, before the industrial era, before modern navigation, before most of the cities now standing on shore were built. It sank then, and it has been traveling, very slowly, ever since. Abyssal plains are not entirely silent in a seismic sense. The ocean floor flexes. It responds to the enormous weight of water above it shifting with the tides. It registers the slow movement of tectonic plates grinding past one another in the distance. Instruments placed on abyssal plains to record these movements pick up signals so faint that on land they would be indistinguishable from background noise. But out there, far from cities, trains, and human infrastructure, the noise floor is low enough that these whispers become legible. Researchers have used abyssal seismometers to map the structure of the mantle beneath the ocean floor, not by waiting for earthquakes, but by listening to the planet breathe. Animals that live on the abyssal plain have adapted to a world of nearly no light and very little food. Most of what falls from above is already partially consumed by the time it arrives. The food arriving at the abyssal floor has passed through multiple layers of ocean life on its way down, and what remains is thin. Organisms here tend to move slowly, live long, and grow at a pace measured in years rather than seasons. Some sea cucumbers on the abyssal floor cover only a few meters per day, grazing across the sediment surface with a patience that matches the pace of everything around them. Others, like certain bivalves, can live for decades without anything that would register as urgency. Opening, filtering, closing. In a world where haste has never offered any advantage. The abyssal plain covers an area larger than all of Earth's land surface combined. The total area of dry land on this planet. Every continent, every island, every desert and glacier comes to roughly 150 million square kilometers. The abyssal plains, at their widest accounting, cover somewhere around 300 million square kilometers. That means the single most common terrain type on this planet is a featureless, cold, dark, sediment-covered floor that almost no human being will ever see directly, and that most people will go their entire lives without thinking about. It exists in the same way the back of a vast library exists, holding something enormous, quietly, without drawing attention. In some parts of the abyssal plain, the sediment is made almost entirely of microscopic shells. When certain single-celled organisms die in the sunlit surface waters, their shells, no larger than a grain of fine sand, begin to sink. In parts of the ocean where these organisms are especially abundant at the surface, the sediment that accumulates below is composed almost entirely of their remains, pressed together into a soft, chalky layer called ooze. Globigerina ooze, made from the shells of tiny plankton called foraminifera, covers enormous stretches of the Atlantic and Indian Ocean floors. If you could hold a handful, it would feel light and almost powdery. A material made entirely of shells so small that each one can only be seen clearly under a microscope, accumulated over millions of years. The abyssal plain receives a kind of rainfall that has nothing to do with clouds. Hydrothermal plumes, columns of warm, mineral-rich water rising from cracks in the ocean floor, carry fine particles upward, and then, as they cool and spread, let them drift back down. Iron particles, manganese particles, and other minerals released from the seafloor travel horizontally in these plumes for hundreds of kilometers before eventually settling. What lands on the plain far from any vent is partly a product of those distant, invisible fountains. In this way, the minerals that form the nodules scattered across the deep floor are not simply dissolved from the water directly above. They have traveled slowly from somewhere else entirely. Light has never touched most of the abyssal floor, not once in its entire history. Even in the earliest oceans, billions of years ago, sunlight could only penetrate the uppermost fraction of the water column. The deep floor of the ocean has existed in permanent darkness since the ocean itself formed. No photon of sunlight has ever reached it. The only light down there is biological. Brief flashes from organisms that produce their own glow. But that light is local, momentary, and vanishes the instant the animal moves away or stops. The darkness of the abyssal plain is not the darkness of a room with the lights off. It is a darkness that has persisted, unbroken, for longer than complex life has existed on land. Some abyssal plains are so remote from continental shelves that they receive almost no terrestrial sediment. The particles that wash off the continents, silt, clay, organic matter from rivers, can travel hundreds of kilometers out to sea, but they rarely reach the most isolated abyssal basins. Those basins, far from any shore, receive their sediment almost entirely from above. From the slow rain of plankton shells, from cosmic dust settling out of the atmosphere, from the fine mineral particles carried by deep ocean currents. In these remote basins, the sediment record is extraordinarily clean, undisturbed by the messier, faster inputs from land. Drilling into it is like reading a very long, very quiet diary written one thin line per millennium. The temperature of the deep ocean has barely changed in living human memory. Measurements taken on abyssal plains in the 1960s and repeated decades later in the same location show temperatures that have remained within a fraction of a degree. The thermal inertia of the deep ocean is so large, and the mixing of deep water so slow, that changes at the surface take many centuries to propagate downward. The abyssal floor exists in something close to thermal stasis, a world where the temperature is set not by what is happening now, but by conditions that prevailed when the water above it last touched the surface, sometimes centuries ago. It is, in a very specific sense, a record of a past climate still being slowly lived out. Abyssal plains sit in some of the most geologically stable parts of Earth's crust. The oldest, coolest, and densest oceanic crust tends to be found far from the mid-ocean ridges where new crust is created. It has had millions of years to cool, contract, and settle. Where this old crust forms the floor of a basin sheltered from tectonic activity, the result is a surface of exceptional geological calm. No volcanoes, no active faults nearby, no significant uplift or subsidence. The sediment layers above it lie flat and undisturbed, like pages in a book that has never been opened. Geologists value these places precisely because the record they contain has not been shuffled, tilted, or erased. A kind of archive that the planet has, entirely by accident, kept in perfect order. The mid-ocean ridge system that separates many abyssal basins is the longest mountain range on Earth. It runs for over 65,000 kilometers. That is roughly 1.5 times the circumference of the planet, and almost none of it has ever been seen by human eyes. The abyssal plains on either side of it lie in its shadow, geologically speaking. Sediment from the ridge flanks slides downward and outward. Hydrothermal fluids from the ridge influence the chemistry of the water filling the basin. The plains themselves are, in a sense, defined by their relationship to the ridge. They are the quiet margins surrounding a slow-motion eruption that has been running continuously for hundreds of millions of years. A single large whale carcass, when it sinks to the abyssal floor, can sustain an entire ecosystem for decades. When a whale dies and sinks, an event researchers call a whale fall. It arrives on the abyssal plain as an extraordinary concentration of organic material in a world that rarely receives any. First, mobile scavengers strip the soft tissue. Then organisms colonize the bones themselves, consuming the lipids stored inside the skeleton over the course of years. Finally, bacteria break down what remains, creating local patches of chemistry that support communities of organisms found nowhere else nearby. A single blue whale carcass can sustain this succession for 50 years or more. A slow, contained abundance in a place where abundance is otherwise almost unknown. The water pressure on the abyssal floor compresses sound in ways that allow it to travel extraordinary distances. There is a layer in the ocean, at intermediate depth, where temperature and pressure combine to create a minimum in the speed of sound. Sound energy bends toward this minimum and becomes trapped, traveling horizontally for thousands of kilometers without significant loss. This layer is called the SOFAR channel, but beneath it, on the abyssal plain, sounds generated on the seafloor. A cracking of rock, a distant landslide, can also propagate upward into this channel and travel across entire ocean basins. Researchers have tracked acoustic signals from underwater events for distances exceeding 15,000 kilometers, roughly the distance from one side of the Pacific to the other and back again. Abyssal sediment cores have been used to reconstruct Earth's climate going back millions of years. A core of sediment drilled from an abyssal plain is a timeline written in chemistry and shell. Each layer records the temperature of the surface ocean at the time it was deposited, encoded in the ratio of oxygen isotopes in the fossil shells of foraminifera. Deeper in the core means older. Each centimeter of depth might represent 10,000 years or more of climate history. Researchers have pulled cores long enough to read back through dozens of ice ages and warm periods. A continuous record of how the planet's climate has pulsed and shifted over timescales that dwarf human history by factors of tens of thousands. The plains hold this archive undisturbed, waiting patiently in the dark. The abyssal plain holds the longest unbroken silence on Earth. Sound travels easily through water. Whales use it, ships track it, researchers measure it across oceans. But on the abyssal floor itself, where sediment is soft and thick and the water above absorbs vibration like a heavy curtain, there is a kind of acoustic stillness that has no equivalent on land. The nearest equivalent might be the interior of a snow-covered forest on a windless night. But even that is noisy by comparison. The abyssal plain is not simply quiet. It is a place where sound itself has very little reason to exist, and what arrives there has traveled so far that it arrives as little more than a faint tremor in the water. Even that tremor settles before long into the sediment, and the silence resumes. Some deep-sea sponges grow no faster than a centimeter per decade. The abyssal plain asks very little of its residents in the way of speed. Food arrives slowly. Light never arrives at all. And the water is cold enough to slow every biological process to something barely above a pause. Certain sponges living at abyssal depths are among the slowest growing organisms ever measured. A centimeter every 10 years, which means a sponge the size of a hand might be centuries old. Some specimens appear to live for thousands of years, making them among the longest-lived animals on the planet. Their strategy is not to race or compete, but simply to persist, filtering whatever the current delivers, expanding grain by grain, outlasting almost everything else alive. The water at abyssal depths has not been at the surface for over 1,000 years. Deep ocean water is old in a way that is difficult to picture when oceanographers measure the age of abyssal water, using dissolved gases and isotopic ratios as their clocks. They find that some of it last touched the atmosphere more than 1,000 years ago. It sank somewhere near Greenland or Antarctica, grew cold and dense, and traveled slowly along the ocean floor, reaching the deep Pacific only after centuries of quiet transit. The water moving past the abyssal sediment right now was surface water during the early medieval period, before printing presses, before the compass reached Europe, before most of the cities we know today existed. It has been traveling, patiently and silently, ever since. The abyssal floor is one of the most geologically stable surfaces on the planet. Earthquakes shake coastlines, mountains rise and erode, rivers carve new channels. But the abyssal plain, resting on old and cold oceanic crust, is largely unbothered by all of this. The crust beneath it has not been geologically active for tens or even hundreds of millions of years. It has cooled, contracted, and settled. The sediment on top of it has accumulated undisturbed, layer upon layer, without faulting or folding or any of the violent rearrangements that shape land surfaces. In some regions, sediment sequences extend downward through time with almost no interruption. A stack of history so orderly it resembles the pages of a book that has never been dropped. Certain abyssal fish have evolved eyes that face upward rather than forward. Deep-sea fish rarely need to look sideways. The only light that reaches the abyssal zone arrives from above. Faint bioluminescent flickers produced by organisms higher in the water column. A fish that can detect these signals from below has a small but real advantage. It can spot the faint silhouette of something moving overhead. Some species have developed tubular eyes, elongated upward like small periscopes, that maximize sensitivity to that thin trickle of light from above while ignoring the darkness on all other sides. It is a way of seeing that has no equivalent on land, shaped entirely by an environment where light has almost no direction at all, except the faint suggestion of up. Abyssal currents move at speeds measured in millimeters per second. The ocean's deep circulation is nothing like its surface. Where waves move at the pace of a running horse and tidal currents can reach several knots, the flows along the abyssal plain are almost imperceptibly slow. Sometimes just a few millimeters each second, roughly the pace at which a fingernail grows. These currents are called thermohaline circulation, drawn by differences in temperature and salinity rather than wind or tide. They move enormous volumes of water eventually, but they do it the way a glacier moves, over timescales that make a human lifetime look brief. A particle of sediment disturbed by one of these currents might drift a few meters in a year, then settle again and rest for centuries. The abyssal plain is home to one of the most abundant animals on Earth. Polychaete worms, a class of segmented marine worms, are found in almost every sediment sample ever taken from the deep ocean floor. They are not dramatic or easily noticed, and a great many species have not yet been formally described, but in terms of sheer numbers and distribution, they are extraordinary. Hundreds of species occupy the abyssal sediment, tunneling through it, processing organic material, recycling nutrients back into the water column. Some estimates suggest that polychaetes account for a significant fraction of all animal individuals on the planet. The abyssal plain, which can seem featureless and empty from a distance, is at centimeter scale a thriving and densely populated place. The pressure at abyssal depth calm presses seawater itself. Water is largely incompressible. This is one of its most useful properties, and the reason hydraulic systems work. But under the pressure of 4 to 5 kilometers of ocean overhead, even seawater calm presses measurably. The water at abyssal depth is slightly denser than it would be at the surface, squeezed by the weight of everything above it. This compression is small, a few percent, but it is enough to affect buoyancy, to alter the speed of sound, and to change the behavior of any organism or instrument brought from the surface. A water sample collected at abyssal depth and brought to the surface actually expands slightly as it rises, the pressure releasing, the molecules spreading back into the space they naturally prefer. The abyssal plain is the destination for almost all of the ocean's dissolved minerals. Rivers carry dissolved material from continents into the sea. Calcium, silica, iron, manganese, and dozens of other elements weathered from rocks over millions of years. Some of this material is incorporated into living organisms. Some settles as sediment near the coasts, and some travels in the deep current until it reaches the abyssal plain. Over geological time, the plain has received a slow and continuous delivery of material from every continent on Earth. The polymetallic nodules found there are partly composed of minerals that began their journey in river water on the other side of the world, transported across ocean basins over millions of years before coming to rest on the floor. Some abyssal regions have gone unstudied for their entire existence. The ocean floor is less mapped than the surfaces of Mars and the Moon. Sonar surveys have produced general topographic maps, but the detailed study of specific abyssal areas, the kind of study that would reveal the organisms living there, the sediment layers beneath the surface, the fine structure of the currents, has been conducted in only a small fraction of the total area. There are basins on the abyssal plain that no human instrument has ever directly observed. They have existed, undisturbed, and dark and cold, for tens of millions of years. Whatever lives there has evolved without ever encountering anything from the surface world, and will likely continue to do so for a long time. Abyssal sediment contains a faint but measurable signal from distant wildfires. Charcoal, the product of burning wood, is extraordinarily durable. Once formed, it resists chemical breakdown for thousands of years, and fine particles of it can travel on wind currents far out over the ocean, eventually settling through the water column to the abyssal floor. Sediment cores from deep basins have been found to contain charcoal layers corresponding to periods of widespread wildfire activity on land. Ancient fire seasons recorded in a place where fire itself is impossible. The abyssal plain preserves signals from a world it has never touched, absorbing the fine residue of continental events and keeping a quiet record of them in the dark. The deep ocean floor reflects almost no light at all. Most surfaces reflect at least some portion of the light that strikes them. Snow reflects nearly all of it. Forest floors reflect a moderate amount, and even dark rock reflects a few percent. The abyssal floor, covered in soft and loosely packed sediment, absorbs almost all incoming light. But since no sunlight reaches those depths, this property is essentially theoretical. The floor has never been tested by sunlight in any meaningful geological period. When research submersibles direct their lights at the sediment, the return is dim and flat. The material is the color of wet flour in some places, pale clay in others, and it drinks in the artificial light without sending much of it back. Xenophyophores are the largest single-celled organisms ever found. On the abyssal plain, where food is scarce and conditions are stable, some organisms have solved the problem of survival by growing extraordinarily large for their cell type. Xenophyophores, a group of giant protists, construct themselves from tubes of their own hardened secretions and can reach 25 centimeters across, roughly the span of an open hand. They are a single cell, technically, housing a vast network of nuclei within one continuous body. Their size allows them to process more sediment and absorb more material than smaller organisms. They are found nowhere else on Earth in quite this form, a shape of life that emerged from the specific quietness and patience of the deep floor. The abyssal plain absorbs carbon that has been in the atmosphere. When marine organisms in sunlit surface waters die, their bodies sink. Much of the organic carbon in those bodies decomposes in the upper ocean and returns to the water as dissolved carbon dioxide. But a fraction, a small and steady fraction, survives the long descent and arrives at the abyssal floor, where it is buried in sediment and removed from circulation for millions of years. This process has been operating continuously throughout Earth's history, drawing down carbon from the ocean and locking it into the rock record. The abyssal plain is not simply a passive floor. It is an active participant in the cycling of carbon across geological time, pulling material downward and keeping it there. The temperature of abyssal water changes by less than 1 degree across entire ocean basins. Imagine a space so thermally uniform that you could travel thousands of kilometers in any direction without finding a meaningful shift in temperature. That is the abyssal plain. The water sitting above the sediment in the deep North Atlantic and the water in the deep South Pacific differ in temperature by less than a single degree Celsius. This near uniformity exists because abyssal water comes from the same source: cold polar surface water that sank and spread. And because the plain is isolated from the seasonal heating and cooling that constantly reshuffles temperatures in the upper ocean, it is the most thermally stable large environment on Earth, a near-perfect constancy maintained across millions of square kilometers. Certain abyssal bacteria can survive on hydrogen gas alone. In the darkest and most nutrient-poor corners of the abyssal sediment, some microbial communities have abandoned the pathways used by most life on Earth and turned instead to chemistry. Hydrogen gas seeps slowly from crustal rocks through a process called serpentinization, a reaction between seawater and certain minerals that releases hydrogen as a byproduct. In these environments, bacteria that oxidize hydrogen for energy have established themselves, drawing on a food source with no connection to sunlight or photosynthesis at all. They are slow, they are few, and they're present one of the most ancient metabolic strategies known, a way of living inherited from early Earth, still operating quietly in the sediment. The abyssal plain stores the cold memory of ice ages. Each time the Earth moved into a glacial period, the oceans cooled, and deep water formation intensified as more cold, dense water sank from the poles. The abyssal plain received this colder water and kept it. When glaciations ended and surface temperatures rose again, the deep water warmed only very gradually, over thousands of years. In this way, the thermal state of the abyssal plain lags behind the surface by millennia, carrying the cold imprint of past ice ages long after the surface world has moved on. The water crossing the deepest parts of the ocean floor today still holds, in trace amounts, the chill of climates that ended before recorded human history. Abyssal plains in the Pacific are older than those in the Atlantic. The ocean floors are not all the same age. New oceanic crust is created at mid-ocean ridges, where tectonic plates pull apart and magma fills the gap. The crust then moves slowly outward from the ridge and gradually ages. The Pacific Ocean is older and wider in its abyssal plains. Sitting on crust formed hundreds of millions of years ago, are significantly older than those in the Atlantic, which began forming only about 180 million years ago when the supercontinent Pangaea split apart. In geological terms, the Atlantic is a young ocean. The Pacific has been accumulating sediment since long before the first dinosaurs walked the Earth. The seafloor of the abyssal plain is coated in a layer of biological origin. The very surface of the abyssal sediment, the top few centimeters, is not simply mineral material. It is a biologically active layer, full of bacteria, meiofauna, and the processed remains of organisms that sank from above. Foraminifera shells make up a large fraction of it in many regions. Silica from diatom frustules and radiolarian tests adds texture and structure. This surface layer has been described as a kind of living skin over the sediment. Thin, fragile, and formed almost entirely from organisms that lived and died in the water column above, then settled over millions of years into the quiet architecture of the floor. Deep-sea holothurians can process an entire body length of sediment every hour. Sea cucumbers, holothurians, are among the most common large animals on the abyssal plain, and in some regions they move across the sediment in dense, slow-moving herds. Their feeding strategy is straightforward. They take in sediment at one end, extract whatever organic material is present, and pass the rest out behind them. In this way, they function as a kind of slow biological plow, turning over the surface layer continuously. A single holothurian can process a remarkable volume of sediment relative to its body size in the course of a day. In some abyssal regions, the seafloor bears the characteristic tracks of their passage. Long, shallow furrows running in quiet parallel across the flat. The abyssal floor holds a record of every major meteor impact for the last 100 million years. When a large object strikes the ocean or a nearby landmass, the shock sends a fine layer of pulverized material outward across the water column. That dust, carrying minerals that are rare in ordinary seafloor sediment, eventually settles onto the abyssal plain and becomes a thin, bright stripe within the sediment stack. A line so distinct that geologists can identify it decades after the first core is pulled. In some basins, more than a dozen such layers have been cataloged, each one marking a separate collision event. The abyssal plain keeps these records far more faithfully than land, where wind and rain and erosion erase what the sea quietly stores. Some abyssal sediment layers smell faintly of sulfur when first brought to the surface. The smell comes from compounds produced by microbial communities buried inside the sediment for millions of years. Communities so ancient and so isolated that they have developed chemical processes found nowhere else on the planet. When a sediment core is opened in a laboratory, the gas is trapped within escape all at once, carrying the chemistry of a world that has been sealed since long before our species existed. Researchers describe the experience as unlike anything else in field science. A breath from a place that has not been in contact with the atmosphere for longer than the oldest known human tools. The scent fades in minutes, but the compounds can be studied for years. Abyssal sediment pressure seals microbes into a kind of suspended chemistry. At the depths where abyssal sediment accumulates, the weight of the water column above creates conditions where certain chemical reactions slow to near imperceptible rates. Microbial cells that would normally complete their metabolic cycles in hours instead stretch a single cycle across decades. These organisms are not dead and not truly dormant. They are simply living at a pace so reduced that the word living barely applies in the way we usually mean it. Their cell walls are intact, their internal chemistry is active, their genetic material is undamaged. They are simply waiting at a pace that has no equivalent in the world above. The abyssal plain is the quietest place on Earth in terms of biological sound production. Every other ecosystem on the planet, from rainforest to coral reef to open ocean surface, generates a constant acoustic background produced by living things. Movement, feeding, communication, reproduction. The abyssal plain produces almost none of this. Animals there are so sparse, so slow, and so widely separated that the biological contribution to ambient sound is effectively zero. What sound exists arrives from elsewhere. From distant ship engines traveling through the deep sound channel, from whale calls launched hundreds of kilometers away, from the subtle crackling of tectonic plates far below. The animals of the abyss live inside a silence that most life on Earth has never encountered. Barite crystals form spontaneously on the abyssal plain, growing without any biological involvement. Barite, barium sulfate, precipitates directly from seawater when certain chemical conditions align, producing dense white crystals that accumulate on the sediment surface in some regions of the deep Pacific. Unlike polymetallic nodules, which require a biological or chemical seed to begin forming, these crystals emerge purely from the chemistry of the surrounding water meeting the chemistry of the sediment below. They grow slowly, accumulating perhaps a few milligrams across a human lifetime. And in some areas, they carpet the floor in pale mineral fields that have been building since before the first whales evolved. The plain is not only a place where things are deposited, it is also a place where things are quietly born. The average abyssal animal weighs less than a single grain of uncooked rice. The animals that live in abyssal sediment are almost entirely meiofauna. Organisms small enough to move between individual sediment particles rather than on top of them. Nematode worms, tiny crustaceans called copepods, and microscopic annelids make up the majority of this community, and most of them are invisible to the naked eye, even when held directly in front of it. Despite their size, they exist in densities that can reach several million individuals per square meter of sediment. A number that seems impossible given the scarcity of food, but which is possible precisely because each animal requires almost nothing. The abyss sustains multitudes by keeping each individual just barely alive. Some regions of the abyssal plain receive no sediment input whatsoever for millions of years at a time. In certain ultra-remote basins, located far from any continental shelf and far from any mid-ocean ridge, the seafloor accumulates sediment at a rate so low it is difficult to calculate with standard instruments. These regions sit beneath ocean surface waters so nutrient poor that almost nothing lives above them and almost nothing falls below. The sediment record in these places is a near perfect blank. Hundreds of meters of core, each centimeter representing tens of thousands of years, showing almost no variation. It is a geological silence that corresponds to a biological one, a place where the ocean's usual productivity simply does not reach. The chemical composition of abyssal water has remained nearly constant for over 30 million years. Deep-water chemistry is buffered by the slow but continuous cycling of the thermohaline circulation, which replenishes the abyss on timescales of roughly 1,000 years. Because this replenishment is slow and the abyss is effectively isolated from the surface, the chemistry of abyssal water changes only over very long intervals. And even then, primarily in response to major shifts in global ocean circulation. Studies of sediment pore water in undisturbed basins show chemical signatures consistent with conditions that existed before most modern mammal families had evolved. The abyssal ocean is not only geologically stable, it is chemically stable in ways that nothing on the surface can approach. Some abyssal fish have no eyes at all. Vision requires light, and where no light has ever penetrated, The biological cost of maintaining functional eyes over millions of generations eventually selects it away. Several families of deep-sea fish have responded by abandoning eyes entirely, producing species with smooth, featureless skin where the eye socket would be in their shallow water relatives. They navigate instead through a highly developed lateral line, a pressure sensing organ that runs along the length of the body and detects disturbances in the water at distances measured in body lengths. They do not move through darkness. They move through a world defined entirely by pressure gradients, chemical traces, and the faint vibrations of anything nearby. Abyssal sediment cores preserve a record of ancient forests that no longer exist. When rivers drain into the sea, they carry dissolved and suspended material from the catchments they cross, including pollen grains, plant wax, and organic compounds specific to the particular vegetation that bordered their upper reaches. Some of this material eventually reaches the deep ocean and settles into abyssal sediment, preserving a record of what was growing on land thousands of kilometers away and hundreds of thousands of years ago. Cores from the Atlantic abyss have been used to reconstruct vegetation patterns across sub-Saharan Africa during climatic periods with no other surviving archive. Not by studying the land directly, but by reading what the rivers carried to the sea and what the sea quietly kept. Radiolarians, single-celled animals, build some of the most elaborate microscopic structures known to science. These organisms construct their shells by secreting silica into lattice spheres, spires, and branching forms of geometric precision that have no parallel in the visible world. When they die, their shells rain slowly to the abyssal floor, accumulating in thick layers called radiolarian ooze across broad regions of the tropical Pacific. Under a microscope, a single gram of this ooze contains thousands of distinct geometric forms, some shaped like perfect spheres within spheres, others like double cones or intricate helmets with symmetry so exact it appears designed. Each one was built by a cell with no brain, no eyes, and no more than a few microns of living material. The deepest abyssal trenches contain sediment that is structurally different from the surrounding plain. Hadal trenches, those descending below 6,000 meters, act as natural sediment traps. Material that accumulates on the surrounding plain can be disturbed by rare turbidity currents or resuspended by passing internal waves. But material that falls into a trench is captured by the geometry of the walls and stays. Over geological time, this creates sediment columns in hadal environments that are far thicker, more calm-pressed, and more chemically distinct than anything on the surrounding plain. The Challenger Deep holds sediment that has been accumulating and calm-pressing without disturbance for longer than the Himalayas have existed in their current form. Every kilogram of abyssal sediment contains measurable amounts of gold. The concentration is far too low for any practical extract ion, typically measured in parts per trillion. But the fact of it is real. Gold, along with platinum, iridium, and a handful of other rare metals, is carried into the deep ocean by rivers, by hydrothermal vents, and by the slow dissolution of seafloor basalt. It settles into sediment and stays, accumulating across millions of years in concentrations that, spread across the entire abyssal plain, represent a quantity of precious metal that exceeds all the gold ever mined in human history. The plain holds this wealth in such dilution that it is simultaneously enormous and utterly unreachable. The abyssal floor is crossed by invisible rivers of cold, dense water called benthic boundary currents. Unlike the water column above, which circulates in broad gyres and oscillating layers, the very bottom of the ocean has its own distinct flow. A thin layer of extremely cold, extremely dense water that moves along the seafloor under the influence of gravity and the Earth's rotation. These flows can travel thousands of kilometers from their formation zones near the poles, carrying dissolved oxygen and trace nutrients to abyssal basins that would otherwise become completely stagnant. They move at speeds measured in centimeters per second, roughly the pace of a very slow walk. And they are one of the primary reasons that even the most remote abyss is not entirely dead. Some abyssal animals live their entire lives without ever leaving the top 2 centimeters of sediment. The biologically active zone of the abyssal floor is extraordinarily thin. A narrow band just at the sediment surface where oxygen from the overlying water can still penetrate and where the sparse input of organic material first arrives. Animals adapted to this zone have body plans optimized for navigating within it rather than above it. Flattened profiles, flexible bodies, limbs proportioned for pushing through packed particles rather than swimming through open water. Below this layer, the sediment becomes anoxic within centimeters, and almost nothing lives there. An entire ecosystem. Diverse, ancient, and functionally complete. Occupies a vertical space smaller than the thickness of a finger. Glass sponges on the abyssal plain build their skeletons from strands of silica finer than the thinnest optical fiber. The silica spicules that form the structural skeleton of hexactinellid sponges are produced by cells that deposit mineral layer by layer in a process that has no equivalent in industrial manufacturing. Each strand is not merely thin, it is geometrically precise, tapered in exact proportions that give the sponge structural resilience despite being made of what is essentially glass. Engineers studying optical fiber transmission have examined these structures in detail, finding that nature arrived at solutions for minimizing light scattering in silica fibers long before the technology existed to manufacture them deliberately. The sponge is not trying to transmit light. It simply grew over millions of years into something that does. Sound moves slightly faster through abyssal water than through the water directly above it. Temperature, salinity, and pressure all influence the speed of sound in seawater, and at abyssal depths, the pressure effect dominates. The immense weight of the water column presses the water below into a medium slightly denser and slightly more elastic than the layers above. The difference is small, a few meters per second, but it has meaningful consequences for how sound energy behaves near the seafloor, slightly refracting downward, traveling waves back upward, and contributing to the natural sound channeling properties of the deep ocean. The abyssal plain does not merely sit at the bottom of this acoustic system. It participates in shaping it in patterns that travel for thousands of kilometers before fading. The oldest living things on Earth may be microbes sealed inside abyssal sediment. In cores extracted from Pacific abyssal sediment more than 100 meters below the seafloor. Sediment deposited over 80 million years ago during the age of the dinosaurs. Researchers have recovered microbial cells that, when given nutrients, resumed metabolic activity. These organisms had not reproduced, had not moved, and had not exchanged material with the outside world for longer than any other known form of life. Whether they are technically the same microbes that were buried all those millions of years ago is a question the science has not yet resolved. What is certain is that the abyss has been keeping something alive, at a pace so slow it barely registers as life at all. Certain abyssal bacteria produce oxygen without sunlight. Most biological oxygen production on Earth is driven by photosynthesis, the conversion of light energy into chemical energy, with oxygen released as a byproduct. But in recent years, researchers studying deep-sea sediment have found evidence of bacterial communities producing oxygen through a completely different mechanism: the reduction of manganese compounds present in the sediment itself. This process, sometimes called dark oxygen production, occurs entirely in the absence of light, driven by chemistry rather than photons. The quantities produced are small compared to photosynthetic output at the surface, but the discovery reshapes a basic assumption about where oxygen can be made and raises questions about what other metabolic inventions are waiting, undisturbed, in the sediment below. Some abyssal regions are so remote that the water above them has never been sampled by any research vessel. The logistics of deep-sea research are formidable. Ships are expensive, time at sea is finite, and the abyssal plain is vast. Most existing oceanographic data comes from a small number of well-traveled corridors. Transects crossed repeatedly by research cruises concentrated near coastlines, established shipping routes, or specific scientific targets. Large portions of the Central Pacific and Southern Indian Ocean abyss have no hydrographic station data from within several hundred kilometers. The seafloor in those regions has been mapped by acoustic methods, but the water column above it, its temperature, chemistry, biology, and current structure, remains entirely unknown. These are not blanks awaiting refinement. They are simply places no one has yet gone. The abyssal floor holds a record of every major volcanic eruption for the past 100 million years. When a large volcano erupts on land or at sea, it sends a plume of fine glass shards, called tephra, into the atmosphere or directly into the water column. These particles are too light to sink quickly. They drift, sometimes for years, slowly descending through the water column until they settle as a thin, pale layer on the sediment below. Geologists reading an abyssal core can identify individual eruptions by their chemical signature, a particular ratio of silicon to iron, a distinctive grain size, and match them to eruptions on land. One thin stripe in a core pulled from the South Pacific matches a volcano that no longer exists above sea level. The abyssal record remembers it. The deep ocean contains its own version of a current with no surface expression at all. Beneath the more familiar ocean circulation systems, water moves along the abyssal floor in slow, dense streams driven entirely by differences in salinity and temperature. These are called contour currents, and they flow parallel to the continental margins, sometimes for thousands of kilometers, at speeds just fast enough to carry fine sediment, but not coarse sand. Their passage sculpts the floor in long, gentle ridges called contourites, low mounded features that can extend for hundreds of kilometers without rising more than a few dozen meters above the surrounding plain. From above, they are nearly invisible. From a sediment core, their layered structure is unmistakable. Alternating bands of slightly coarser and finer material, recording centuries of slow current variation. Abyssal sediment holds the magnetic signature of the ocean floor at the time it was laid down. When sediment particles containing iron minerals settle through the water column, they align faintly with Earth's magnetic field before coming to rest. Once buried, that alignment is preserved indefinitely, Because Earth's magnetic poles have reversed dozens of times over geological history, flipping north to south and back again on cycles of hundreds of thousands of years. Abyssal sediment carries a striped magnetic record of each reversal in sequence. The last full reversal happened roughly 780,000 years ago. In a core long enough to reach that depth, the transition appears not as a sharp line, but as a gradual zone roughly 5 centimeters thick. The slow drift of particles through water during the decades the field spent reorienting itself. There are animals on the abyssal floor that reproduce only once in their entire lives. For many deep-sea invertebrates, the energetic cost of producing eggs or larvae is so high relative to the food available that spawning is a one-time event. Some species of abyssal brittle stars, thin-armed relatives of sea stars, are thought to reach reproductive maturity only after several decades of slow growth, then release a single cohort of larvae before their energy reserves are permanently depleted. The larvae themselves face extraordinary odds. To survive, they must drift upward, find food in the water column, and eventually settle onto a suitable patch of sediment. A process that may take months and ends, for most, in failure. The ones that succeed begin the same slow wait their parents completed. Every square meter of the abyssal floor receives, on average, less than half a milliliter of water movement per day from bottom currents. This near-total stillness means that the very top layer of sediment, the layer in contact with the overlying water, behaves more like a gel than a solid surface. Fine particles settle into it and are held in place, not by compression, but by the cohesion of the surrounding material. An animal moving across this surface leaves an impression that can persist for years before being erased by the slow rain of new particles from above. In places where bottom currents are absent entirely, the top millimeter of sediment may remain undisturbed for decades at a stretch. A surface that has had no contact with moving water since before many living humans were born. The abyssal plain is the largest carbon-stable environment on Earth, carbon that reaches the seafloor. Whether as organic material from dead organisms, as carbonate shells from surface plankton, or as dissolved compounds in sinking water, is effectively removed from the active carbon cycle for millions of years. The abyssal sediment column contains an estimated 4 times as much carbon as the entire terrestrial biosphere, including all soil, all vegetation, and all peat. Most of it arrived gradually over tens of millions of years and will remain there until tectonic subduction carries the ocean floor back into the mantle. That journey takes, on average, 150 million years. The time between now and the early Cretaceous, when the continents still carried dinosaurs across their surfaces. Some abyssal worms build tubes out of sediment particles and never leave them. These tube-dwelling polychaetes select individual grains from the surrounding sediment and cement them together using a secretion produced in glands near their mouth. The resulting structure is not random. Different species show distinct preferences for grain size and shape, and the finished tubes, examined under a microscope, have a consistency that looks almost deliberate. A worm living in such a tube feeds by extending tentacles into the water just above the sediment surface, gathering whatever organic material drifts within reach. If disturbed, it withdraws in under a second and may not re-emerge for hours. The tube itself, once abandoned, can persist in the sediment for thousands of years. A hollow cylinder of cemented grains, with no occupant remaining. Abyssal basins in the Central Pacific contain sediment that is measurably older, grain for grain, than sediment anywhere else on Earth's ocean floor. The Pacific Basin is the oldest oceanic basin currently in existence. Parts of it have been accumulating sediment since before the Atlantic opened. In the most remote central Pacific regions, far from any spreading center and far from any continental source of erosion material, the sediment accumulates at less than 1 millimeter per thousand years, a layer 5 centimeters thick. In such a location represents 50 million years of uninterrupted deposition, deposited across a span roughly equal to the time between the extinction of the non-avian dinosaurs and the present day. The sediment beneath that layer is older still. The abyssal floor contains natural structures called manganese crusts that form on exposed rock surfaces rather than on soft sediment, where the seafloor has a hard substrate. An old basalt outcrop, the rim of a seamount, the steep face of a ridge. Manganese and iron dissolved in seawater slowly precipitate out and coat the surface in a dark, layered shell. These crusts grow at roughly 1 to 5 millimeters per million years, making them among the slowest forming solid materials in the natural world. A crust 2 centimeters thick has been accumulating since before our genus existed. Inside its layers, like rings in a very slow tree, are chemical records of the water chemistry that surrounded it, including traces of ancient ocean temperatures, salinity shifts, and the slow drift of dissolved minerals across geological time. The water immediately above the abyssal floor, a layer called the benthic boundary layer, has measurably different properties from the water just a few meters higher. Suspended sediment particles, stirred by the faint currents moving along the floor, give this layer a slight turbidity that the clearer water above it lacks. Temperature gradients within it can shift by a fraction of a degree over a vertical distance of just a few meters. Dissolved oxygen decreases toward the floor as organisms and chemical reactions consume it. The boundary layer is not a fixed feature. It thickens when currents strengthen and thins when they slow. But it is always present, a distinct zone of transition between the open water column and the surface of the world it rests above. Most abyssal animals spend their entire lives within it. There are locations on the abyssal floor where sediment has not been touched by any current for so long that the surface has developed a faint chemical crust from contact with the overlying water alone. Dissolved silica and manganese in the water column slowly react with the topmost sediment particles over timescales of thousands of years, binding them into a loosely consolidated skin that differs from the material just centimeters below. This process, sometimes called seafloor lithification at its most incipient stage, creates a surface that is slightly firmer than fresh sediment, like the skin that forms on undisturbed custard. It has no name in common use and no clear threshold at which it begins, but its presence can be detected by the force required to push a sampling instrument through the first few millimeters of the floor. The abyssal fauna includes animals that are entirely translucent. In the deep ocean, where no sunlight penetrates and bioluminescence is the only light source, pigmentation offers no advantage for camouflage, and producing it costs energy. Many abyssal shrimps, amphipods, and small fish have therefore lost their coloration entirely over evolutionary time, leaving bodies through which internal organs are faintly visible. Under white laboratory light, they appear ghostly, their digestive tracts visible as dark lines, their hearts visible as small, rhythmic contract ions. In their natural environment, they are effectively invisible, producing no reflection and carrying no color. A net sample of abyssal fauna brought quickly to the surface and photographed before the animals expire, looks like a collection of glass sculptures. Delicate, pale, and entirely see-through. The pressure at the deepest abyssal plains calm presses the water itself to a measurable degree. Seawater at 6,000 meters depth is roughly 2.8% denser than the same water would be at the surface. A small but real compression that changes how sound travels through it, how dissolved gases behave within it, and how the organisms living in it must maintain their internal chemistry. Many abyssal fish and invertebrates use a strategy called piezophily, an evolved preference for and physiological dependency on high-pressure conditions. Their enzymes, cell membranes, and metabolic pathways are tuned to function optimally at 400 atmospheres. Brought to the surface, their internal chemistry destabilizes, not from temperature change, but from the sudden absence of the pressure their biology was built around. The abyssal floor has areas where the sediment itself generates a faint electrical field. In regions where organic material is abundant enough to support active microbial communities, bacteria consume electrons from organic compounds and pass them, sometimes across distances of several centimeters, through long filamentous structures called cable bacteria. These microscopic chains act as biological wires, connecting oxygen-rich sediment near the surface to deeper, oxygen-poor zones below. The process produces a measurable voltage gradient across the sediment column, a tiny electrical current generated entirely by living things. The first measurements of this phenomenon were taken in relatively shallow coastal sediments, but similar signals have since been detected in the upper layers of abyssal sediment cores, suggesting that life in the deep is not merely surviving, but actively managing its chemical environment. Some of the oldest undisturbed sediment sequences on Earth are not in mountains or canyons. They are lying flat on the abyssal floor. On land, geological strata are calm-pressed, tilted, eroded, and metamorphosed by tectonic forces. In the deep ocean, away from spreading centers and subduction zones, sediment simply accumulates layer by layer without deformation. The resulting sequences can preserve a continuous, undisturbed record stretching back 60 or 70 million years. A vertical archive in which each centimeter downward is another step into deep time. Drilling into such a sequence is the geological equivalent of reading a book with no torn pages. The information is intact, in order, and exactly where it was left by the ocean that deposited it. The abyssal floor is one of the few environments on Earth where nitrogen cycling operates without the input of sunlight. On land and in surface waters, photosynthesis drives the conversion of atmospheric nitrogen into biologically available forms. In the deep ocean, this pathway does not exist. Instead, nitrogen cycles through the abyssal system via microbial processes alone. Bacteria that oxidize ammonia released by decomposing organisms, others that reduce nitrate back to nitrogen gas, and still others that fix dissolved nitrogen directly from the water column without light energy. The result is a closed nitrogen loop operating in permanent darkness, sustained entirely by chemical gradients and the slow rain of organic material from above. It is a complete biogeochemical cycle running without a sun. There are sediment cores from the abyssal floor that contain identifiable plant waxes from species that no longer exist. Land plants produce long-chain fatty acids as part of their surface coatings, waxy molecules that are chemically stable and resistant to decomposition. These compounds wash from land into rivers, travel to the ocean, and eventually settle on the abyssal floor. In cores taken from basins that received river input during earlier geological periods, plant waxes from Eocene or Oligocene forests. Forests composed of species long since extinct are present and chemically identifiable. The molecules themselves have survived 40 or 50 million years of burial. They are, in a literal sense, the chemical remains of leaves that fell in forests that no longer exist on a landscape that has since been entirely remade. The abyssal ocean is crossed by a kind of invisible geography defined entirely by water density, deep water masses. The North Atlantic deep water, the Antarctic bottom water, the Pacific deep water. Each carry distinct chemical signatures from the surface conditions under which they formed. These masses flow through the abyssal basins in layers, not fully mixing, maintaining their identities for hundreds or thousands of years after leaving the surface. A water sample taken from 600 meters and another from 5,000 meters in the same location may have formed at the ocean surface in different centuries and in different hemispheres, and will carry chemical records of entirely different surface conditions. The abyssal ocean is not a single body of water. It is an archive of many different oceans, stacked quietly on top of one another. The abyssal floor is home to a type of organism that has no mouth, no digestive tract, and no recognizable organ systems, and yet is classified as an animal. Placozoa are among the simplest multicellular animals known. Their relatives live in shallow, warm waters, but related organisms with similarly simplified body plans have been recovered from abyssal sediment samples. They move by gliding, absorb nutrients directly through their ventral surface, and have no front, back, or symmetry axis. Their genome, when finally sequenced, turned out to be surprisingly large for so apparently simple a body, containing genes whose functions suggest a complexity that the visible body gives no indication of. They are a reminder that simplicity in structure and simplicity in biology are not the same thing. The abyssal plain, considered as a single landscape, has had longer continuous existence than any other environment on Earth's surface. Mountain ranges rise and are eroded away. Forests are replaced by grasslands and then deserts. Continental shelves flood and drain with each ice age. The deep ocean floor, by contrast, has been the deep ocean floor. Cold, dark, pressurized, and sediment receiving, for longer than any terrestrial environment has maintained its character. The Pacific abyssal plain has been accumulating sediment in essentially its current form for over 150 million years. The organisms living there now are the descendants of organisms that lived in essentially the same conditions when the continents were arranged differently, when the surface world above them was unrecognizable, and when the slow fall of marine snow had already been ongoing for longer than our entire family tree. The deepest abyssal sediments contain water that was never river water, never rain, never part of any living thing. This water arrived at the seafloor as dense, cold surface water that sank in polar regions and then slowly spread across the bottom of every ocean basin. By the time it settled into the sediment pores at 4,000 meters depth, it had already traveled for centuries. It had crossed ocean basins without touching light, without warming, without changing its chemistry in any significant way. The water inside a grain of sediment in the Central Pacific may have last touched open ocean over 1,000 years ago. And inside the sediment itself, it has been still for far longer than that. It is not trapped water. It is simply water that arrived, settled, and found no reason to leave. The abyssal floor is home to one of the most patient animals on Earth, the sea spider. A long-legged arthropod related distantly to land spiders, but adapted entirely to the deep. Moves across abyssal sediment so slowly that its progress cannot be measured in hours. Some species take minutes to complete a single step. Their legs are so thin, they are nearly transparent, and their bodies so compressed that many of their organs have been pushed out into the legs themselves, simply for lack of room in the torso. They navigate by touch and chemical trace across a surface they have never seen. A sea spider crossing 1 meter of abyssal floor has completed what, for it, is an entire journey. The distance it covers in a lifetime could be walked by a person in an afternoon. Abyssal sediment produces its own slow chemistry entirely in the dark. Far below the reach of sunlight, and well below the last traces of photosynthesis, driven oxygen, a different kind of chemistry unfolds. Sulfate from seawater diffuses down through the sediment column and is consumed by microbes that have no use for light. These organisms break down buried organic matter using sulfate the way surface organisms use oxygen. As an electron acceptor, the last step in a chemical chain. As they do this, they release sulfide, which then reacts with iron in the sediment to form iron sulfide minerals. Dark, fine-grained crystals that accumulate in thin bands through the sediment. These bands are a geological signature, a record that microbial life was present and active at this depth, at this point in time, processing the quiet rain of organic matter that reached them from the surface far above. Some abyssal organisms produce light in a place where no light has ever reached from outside. Bioluminescence in the deep ocean is not rare. It is, by most estimates, the most common form of light production on Earth. Animals in the mid-water zone use it to find mates, to lure prey, to confuse predators. But bioluminescence has also been documented organisms living on or just above the abyssal floor. Sea cucumbers that glow when disturbed, brittle stars that release luminescent mucus, small crustaceans that emit brief cold flashes. The abyssal plain, which receives no sunlight, no moonlight, and no starlight, still contains light, produced by the animals themselves, entirely on their own terms. A slow blue flash lasting less than a second in 4 kilometers of darkness. Then, stillness again. The chemical signature of ancient seawater is preserved inside abyssal fossils. When small organisms with calcite or aragonite shells die and sink to the abyssal floor, their shells begin a slow process of chemical exchange with surrounding sediment water. But in the right conditions, cold temperature, low acidity, minimal disturbance. Some of this exchange is incomplete, and the original chemistry of the shell is partially preserved. By analyzing the ratio of certain isotopes trapped inside these shells, scientists can reconstruct what the surface ocean looked like at the time the animal was alive. Its temperature, its salinity, its carbon content. A single foraminifera shell 1 millimeter across, buried in abyssal sediment for 5 million years, still carries a faint chemical memory of the ocean surface where it once floated. The abyssal floor has absorbed the weight of 5 mass extinction events without changing its fundamental character. Each of the great extinction events in Earth's history, the end Ordovician, the late Devonian, the Permian Triassic, the Triassic Jurassic, the extinction that ended the age of dinosaurs, reorganized life on land, and in the upper ocean profoundly. Species vanished, ecosystems rebuilt from scratch. But in the abyssal sediment record, these events appear not as catastrophes, but as transitions. A shift in the species of foraminifera, a change in the ratio of silica to calcium carbonate in the ooze, a brief gap in certain fossil types. The deep plane continued. Sediment continued to fall. Microbes continued to process it. Whatever lived through each transition at these depths adapted slowly, or was replaced slowly, and the floor itself was never emptied, never sterilized, never silenced. The abyssal floor holds a record of the sun's own behavior over millions of years. Certain isotopes of beryllium, specifically beryllium-10, are produced when cosmic rays strike the upper atmosphere. They fall to Earth dissolved in rain and eventually reach the ocean, where they sink and are incorporated into abyssal sediment at a steady rate. Because the production of beryllium-10 depends on how many cosmic rays reach the atmosphere, and the number of cosmic rays reaching the atmosphere depends partly on the strength of the sun's magnetic field. The concentration of beryllium-10 in layered abyssal sediment is a faint but measurable record of solar activity. Buried in the quiet sediment of the deep Pacific is a timeline of the sun. Not its light, but its magnetism, its cycles, its variability, stretching back millions of years. Abyssal water carries dissolved silicon released by the slow dissolution of diatom shells. Diatoms are single-celled algae that build intricate glass shells, silica frustules, and live in enormous numbers in the sunlit surface ocean. When they die, their shells sink. Some dissolve in the water column. Some reach the abyssal floor and slowly dissolve there, releasing silicic acid back into the deep water. This dissolved silicon then becomes available to be carried by ocean circulation back toward the surface, where future generations of diatoms will use it to build new shells. The silicon in a living diatom shell may have already been part of thousands of previous shells, dissolved and resupplied across millions of years, moving up and down through the water column in a cycle that connects the sunlit surface to the lightless floor and back again. The gentlest current on Earth flows just above the abyssal plane. Near-bottom currents in most abyssal basins move at speeds that cannot be felt by any instrument designed for surface conditions. Fractions of a centimeter per second, so slow that a particle of sediment stirred by one of these currents might take hours to settle back to the floor. In the most sheltered basins, enclosed by ridges on multiple sides, the bottom water is effectively still. The only detectable motion is a slow, basin-wide rotation driven by the Earth's own spin, a gentle Coriolis drift that turns the water in the same direction as the planet turns below it. The abyssal basin breathes in this rotation. One slow turn over the course of weeks, and the floor beneath it remains undisturbed. Some abyssal sediment layers were deposited not by sinking particles, but by underwater avalanches. Turbidity currents. Dense, sediment-laden flows that rush down continental slopes and spread across the abyssal plain can deposit meters of material in hours. These events are triggered by earthquakes, by the overloading of sediment on a slope, by the destabilization of gas hydrate-bearing sediment. When they arrive on the abyssal plain, they spread in a thin, graded layer. Coarse material at the base, fine material at the top, that geologists call a turbidite. A single turbidite layer may be just a few centimeters thick, but it represents an event that moved millions of tons of material across thousands of square kilometers in a single night. These layers interrupt the otherwise undisturbed sequence of slow sediment rain, and they are visible in sediment cores as sudden jumps in grain size. The temperature of the abyssal ocean has dropped by more than 10 degrees Celsius since the early Eocene. 50 million years ago, the world was warm enough that there were no polar ice caps. The deep ocean, fed by dense water sinking from warm polar seas, was several degrees above freezing. As Antarctica glaciated and Arctic ice began to form, the source water for the deep ocean became colder. By the time the Great Ice Ages began, the abyssal ocean had cooled to near its current temperature, just above freezing in most basins. That long cooling is recorded in the chemistry of abyssal foraminiferous shells, layer by layer, through the sediment column. The abyssal plain is not static in its coldness. It arrived at its coldness through 50 million years of slow cooling, and the sediment beneath it holds every degree of that descent. Certain abyssal bacteria can remain viable after being frozen in ice, thawed, and returned to pressure. Experiments with abyssal sediment cores have shown that some of the microorganisms recovered from the deepest layers. Organisms that have lived their entire existence at near freezing temperatures and crushing pressure are not killed by the conditions of retrieval or short-term storage. When returned to simulated abyssal conditions, some resume metabolic activity. This resilience is not because these organisms are especially tough in the way surface bacteria are tough. It is because they have evolved to live at the margins of activity. Their enzymes are tuned for cold and pressure. Their membranes are built to remain fluid in conditions that would solidify a surface organism's cell wall entirely. They do not survive harsh conditions. They survive because those conditions are, for them, home. The abyssal floor has a horizon. From any point on the abyssal plain, the flat sediment surface extends in every direction until it reaches the base of a ridge, a seamount, or a continental slope. And in the largest basins, that distance is measured in hundreds of kilometers. If there were light, and if a creature could stand on the abyssal floor and look out, the floor would curve away in a perfect flat arc, disappearing not into mist, but simply into the geometric limit of line of sight on a sphere. The horizon of the abyssal plain is the same kind of horizon visible from a ship on a calm sea, except that it is 4 kilometers below that ship, and the sky above it is not air, but water. And what moves through it does so in darkness and silence. Abyssal sediment cores have captured the moment when a comet or asteroid struck the Earth. At the boundary between Cretaceous and Paleogene sediment, 66 million years ago, abyssal cores from every ocean basin show the same thing: a thin layer enriched in iridium, an element rare in Earth's crust but common in meteorites. Above the layer, the fossil assemblage changes. Below it, a different assemblage of species. This layer, sometimes no thicker than a fingernail, is the global signature of the impact. Material dispersed into the upper atmosphere, circling the planet, and settling slowly into every part of the ocean. The abyssal floor received it like it receives everything, quietly, without acknowledgement, layer by layer, storing it for 66 million years until a core sample brought it back to the surface and into the light. The oldest sediment on the abyssal floor has never been disturbed by any living thing. In a narrow band of sediment at the very base of the oldest abyssal sequences, in parts of the Central Pacific where crust formed during the Jurassic, 180 million years ago, The sediment is old enough that the microbial community above it has long since exhausted all available nutrients. Below a certain depth in the core, the sediment has been chemically inert for tens of millions of years. No organism has moved through it. No burrowing animal has reworked it. The layers are as they fell, grain by grain, shell fragment by shell fragment, slowly accumulating in darkness until the sediment above them grew thick enough to seal them away. They are the most undisturbed material on the surface of the planet. Some abyssal fish communicate through vibration rather than sound. In a medium where sound travels faster and farther than anywhere on land, the deep ocean might seem built for acoustic communication. And for many deep-sea animals, it is. But certain fish living just above the abyssal floor use a different channel. They produce low-frequency vibrations by contracting muscles attached to their swim bladders, generating signals that travel not through the open water, but through the ground, through the sediment itself, as seismic waves detectable only at close range. These are not sounds so much as touches at a distance. A signal produced this way does not carry far. It is intimate by design. Two fish separated by a few body lengths, communicating through the floor between them, in a place where no light reaches, and open water sound would carry their message to every predator in the basin. The abyssal plain is geologically the most stable environment on Earth, and also among the most ancient. Continental surfaces are scraped by glaciers, folded by tectonics, eroded by rivers, rebuilt by volcanism. Even oceanic crust near spreading centers is young and geologically active. But the oldest abyssal plains, in the Central Pacific, sit atop oceanic crust that has not been deformed, intruded, or significantly altered for over 150 million years. The sediment above it is a quiet archive of everything that has happened since. No mountain range on Earth's surface is that old. No continental plain has sat undisturbed for that long. The abyssal plain has outlasted entire tectonic cycles, entire oceans that opened and closed, entire chapters of life on land. And it is still there, still accumulating, still quiet. Water reaching the abyssal floor today began its descent before most of the world's great cities existed. The formation of deep water begins at the surface. In the North Atlantic, around Greenland and Iceland, and in the Southern Ocean near Antarctica. Dense, cold, salty water sinks and spreads along the ocean floor, taking centuries to complete a single circuit of the deep ocean. The water currently settling onto the abyssal floor of the tropical Pacific left the surface before many of the world's oldest continuously inhabited cities had yet been founded. It has traveled the entire width of the Pacific along the floor, in complete darkness, carrying the chemistry of a surface ocean that no living person has ever seen. When it finally settles into the sediment, it will remain there, changing very slowly for centuries more. The abyssal plain holds the most complete record of Earth's climate that exists anywhere on the planet. Ice cores from Antarctica extend back 800,000 years. Cave formations can preserve climate signals for a few million years under the right conditions. But abyssal sediment cores in the oldest and least disturbed basins hold a continuous record stretching back over 100 million years, covering ice ages and greenhouse periods, ocean and noxic events, the aftermath of major volcanic episodes, and the slow drift of continents across latitudes. This record is not written in language. It is written in the chemistry of shells, the size of grains, the presence or absence of certain organisms, the ratio of isotopes locked inside calcite, Reading it requires instruments and patience, but the record itself required nothing but time, darkness, and the quiet persistence of gravity pulling everything slowly downward. The abyssal plane asks nothing of the things that settle onto it. It receives what arrives: a foraminiferous shell, a whalebone, a grain of dust blown from a desert 10,000 kilometers away, a microbe carried in a current that began at the surface centuries ago. And it keeps it. There is no selection, no preference, no process of judgment. What reaches the floor stays. What has stayed for 1,000,000 years will likely stay for 1,000,000 more. In this, the abyssal plane is unlike almost every other place on Earth. Forests burn, coastlines erode, mountains are taken apart grain by grain, but the flat, dark, patient floor of the deep ocean simply receives and holds and continues. It is the quietest kind of permanence there is. And so we've come to the end of our time in the deep. We began in a way where the abyssal plane itself begins. At the edge of things, where the continental shelf falls away and the floor drops into a darkness so complete and so old that it has its own kind of stillness. Over 100 facts, 100 moments of quiet, of scale, of time so long it bends the imagination gently and then lets it go. You are part of this story too. The water in your body has passed through the ocean. The carbon in your breath will one day reach the surface of the sea, and from there perhaps it will slowly settle, carried downward, grain by grain, into the same dark archive that holds the shells of creatures that lived before the first flower ever opened on land. You are not separate from the deep. You are continuous with it. Let your breathing slow now. Let the images settle. The flat, dark plain, the slow drift of marine snow, the ancient stillness of water that has not touched light in 1,000 years. You don't need to hold any of it. It will be there when you wake. The abyssal floor will still be receiving, still accumulating, still patient, as it has been for 150 million years. The deep is quiet, and so are you. Good night, and sleep well.